Oh man, what's happening, everybody? How y'all doing? I was just sitting here amusing myself, going, "Ding ding goes the trolley, ding ding goes the bell." Welcome back to the Matt Mettler Podcast. I'm very glad to be here with you. I'm trying out my new microphone arm. It's pretty sweet. I don't have to hold my microphone. And I'm trying to take advantage of the fact that it's relatively quiet in here right now. There's all kind of weird noises in where I'm staying. The only thing I'm competing with is a little bit of noise out of the kitchen. So if you're wondering why this one's noisier, there's noises in my environment, right? I was laughing, sitting here thinking to myself, there's too many Matt Mettlers in the world for me. It'd be my fantasy if there was only me. There's too many Matt Mettlers in the world for me. Yeah, people. There's too many Matt Mettlers, man. When I looked up, it's one of those funny things. You know, you Google yourself. You should be careful what you Google yourself at. But when you Google yourself, you find out really interesting, fun, entertaining stuff about yourself that you may or may not have known. Like there's several other dudes in the world named Matt Mettler. And I know what the problem is. The problem is that Matt Mettler just rolls off the tongue, right? It's one of those things where your parents are thinking about a name. Their last name is Mettler. They're like, Matt Mettler. Boom, done, sold. Sold to the first bidder. And so as a result of that, there's got to be at least 15 other guys in America named Matt Mettler. So I would like to invite parents who have the last name Mettler, please, at least for a while, stop naming your children Matt. You're killing us. There's already enough. There's too many Matt Mettlers in the world. Yeah, too many Matt Mettlers in the world, people. If your name is Matt Mettler, don't know what to tell you. There's a lot of Matt Mettlers in the world. There's only one mattmettler.com. And fortunately, I was smart enough to buy that. You got to look out into the distance and see it coming. So right about here in my podcast is where my audio interface completely crashed. And actually, I shouldn't even blame it on my audio interface. It's where my computer recording completely crashed. And when I restarted my computer, my microphone sounded different. I don't know exactly why, but that's why my mic sounds different. So one of the things that I just wanted to say in this show, and this just comes as trying to be honest and open about just being a human being, right? I'm not perfect. I have made mistakes in my life, people. I've done things that I'm not proud of. And I hope that at this point in my life, I'm forgiven for those things. But I acknowledge them. I acknowledge that I've made mistakes. I'm not perfect. I don't want to come off like some sort of jackass know-it-all, telling everybody what they should do, but not be able to admit my own mistakes. I think that that's real growth, is being able to admit the mistakes that you made. I have made mistakes, but my goal is to learn from them and to not make habits out of them, right? So something pretty interesting just happened. Something very cool happened in Denver. Something that I really hadn't anticipated having happen so soon, which is that Denver, by a very narrow margin, voted to decriminalize magic mushrooms, which I think is a tremendously forward-thinking move. Here's my stance on it, right? I suppose you might call me I've dubbed it American shamanism. American shamanism. If there is a religion that I believe in, I would call that American shamanism. So as a result of that, the idea that magic mushrooms being decriminalized is actually wonderful. I don't think that mushrooms should be used frivolously. I don't think that mushrooms should be taken merely for the purposes of entertainment. Since they are an awareness-altering drug, I think that even if you take them with the idea that you're just gonna have a good time, you will end up having a deeper experience whether you like it or not. So I think that mushrooms are one of those things where they are powerful and they need to be used wisely. They need to be used properly. But I also believe a lot in freedom, and I don't believe in the idea of restricting plants and or mushrooms. Mushrooms exist in that weird space between animals and plants. So I think that that's incredibly forward thinking on the part of Denver. And I'm very glad to see those sort of initiatives finding a home here. I know that there's probably people out there that are just like, what is Colorado doing? They're going to make everything legal. In my opinion, that would be the best thing that we could do. Based on my experience and how it put me out of business selling weed, legalizing things is an incredibly powerful force for good. Even if you don't entirely like the premise of it, for instance, say you don't believe in people smoking pot. Well, you have to admit that what we have with this voluntary system and this the system that we have now is better than cops out there haranguing people for weed. It just is. Especially in a world with as much marijuana as we have, it's a complete waste of time for police officers to waste their time on people with weed. Unless that's actually the crux of the problem, right? I mean, if it's just an addendum, then they shouldn't waste their time on it. And I'm very glad to see that they're gonna make it the lowest priority for police, which I think is great, right? Because that is the initial first step, is just saying that let's make it a lower priority in the enforcement rankings. That's a great place to start. How about we just don't look at people that have mushrooms as criminals? Or we don't look at people that have a marijuana as criminals. How about that? I hadn't actually intended to talk about this, but since I'm on the subject, I really do feel like one of the last bastions of discrimination left is people who choose to use marijuana. Or for that matter, people who choose to use drugs. Like you're not allowed to discriminate against people for anything else in the world. I don't think that you should be allowed to discriminate against them for weed or kratom or things like that anymore either. I really don't see what that has to do with anything. One of the most interesting things about America categorically is that technically you don't have a drug problem until it impacts your ability to interact with others or pay your bills or be a good citizen, right? Like, America is a ridiculous place in that sense. Like, you can do as much drugs as you want as long as it doesn't cause you to be rude or indigent or unable to pay your bills, right? And we have a very interesting philosophy in America about that. So I think that's great that Denver is so forward-thinking. I think it's really great that there's enough people in Denver that are so forward-thinking as to recognize that the best policies are harm reduction. The best policies are to allow it in a capacity where it's observed and then back off, right? That's probably the best thing that you can do. And for the record, I'm not in favor of minors having access to mushrooms or marijuana for that matter. And I don't promote that. I do believe that people need to wait until they're a certain age to start smoking buds or to take mushrooms. I think that either one of those I don't think that they should be done as children. And I certainly don't think that they should be done as early teenagers. Once you hit 18, you're an adult in that respect, right? You should have the right to decide. I do promote the idea that if you were going to do mushrooms, try and have the following things in place. Be in the company of friends that can observe you, and that if there's any problems, they can assist you. Do it in a friendly environment. Don't take them the first time and then go out and do something that because it's going to be a crazy, wild experience. It's going to be a powerful, mind-changing, probably life-changing experience that you're going to have. So I don't recommend fooling around with mushrooms. If you desire to take mushrooms to seek enlightenment, then by all means do that. Do your homework. Do it as safely as you possibly can, right? I completely believe in the power of mushrooms to intercede with depression. Because in the past, when I've taken mushrooms, there is a feeling the morning after, of today is the first day of the rest of my life. I have nothing but opportunity in front of me, right? There is something wonderful about that. There is something soul refreshing about that. And I also believe that if you take them in a high enough dose, you will restart your mental computer. and possibly run updates on that bad boy at the same time. There's something there that we need to look at and research and understand. And I'm glad that we're at the cusp of being able to have these conversations in Colorado. That's an amazing thing. It really is, because I don't want people to go to jail for plants anymore. I don't want people to go to jail for exploring the interior of their minds anymore. I do believe in enough freedom to give people the opportunity to try things. I saw a thing where a guy was taking mushrooms for chronic migraine headaches that he was having, and he would only take them about once every month and a half or 2 months, something like that, I seem to recall. It would alleviate his symptoms for like 2 months at a time. Perfect example, right? It helps him to live a more meaningful, productive, better life. I don't want to stand in the way of that. I think that that is something that we need to, as adults, come to terms with, is giving people the freedom to choose the medicines that they put in their own body. Well, and or just give them the freedom to choose the things that they choose to ingest or use, right? I don't want people to tell me what I can or cannot do when it comes to the things that I'm allowed to ingest. So I feel like it's hypocritical to try and tell other people what they can or cannot ingest. I just invite everybody that, safety and moderation in all things, right? These are good things to follow. Another good example is that recently we went through a thing where they were going to ban kratom. I'm just going to call it kratom, though. I appreciate that it's called kratom where they're from, but I'm just going to call it kratom. We recently, not that long ago, went through a thing where they were trying to ban kratom over the fact that, in my opinion, the reason that they want to ban it is because it replaces so many pharmaceuticals. In my opinion, it replaces Xanax, it replaces your anti-anxiety medications, it provides a little bit of pain relief, so it has kind of like an analgesic sort of effect. It has a really nice, even-keeled calmness that it brings about. It would replace many of the other drugs that they would prescribe for you. And part of the reason that I think that they don't like kratom is because they can't patent it. They cannot put a patent on it, right? Like big corporations that specialize in medicines, you may have noticed they don't spend a lot of time looking at whether plants or simple remedies will solve your problem. They always look towards pills and things that are chemically synthesized. There's a reason for that. And that is that you are not allowed to patent plants. You can't just patent marijuana. Thank goodness for that, because I guarantee that there would be companies out there trying to claim that they own the patent to corn, and that we would all have to pay them for the privilege of just eating corn. There's a reason that you're not allowed to patent plants, right? But that's also the reason that you don't see a lot of medicinal companies mucking around too much with plants, because they know that when it comes to trying to patent it as a pharmaceutical, it will be problematic. Versus when it's just something that you straight up synthesize, no problem whatsoever. The patent process is a completely different thing then. I think that that's part of the reason that they hate on kratom, is because it could potentially replace a lot of other medications that frankly are more expensive. If you buy kratom in bulk, it's actually very inexpensive. It's a very inexpensive treatment. Based on what I've seen about why they were trying to outlaw it, is very tenuous. They're trying to very tenuously assert that a couple of suicides were related to kratom overdose. I don't know, man. I've taken kratom a fair bit. I've never felt anything like that. I've never had the urge to hurt myself as a result of never. Not at all. If anything, I think it sort of gives you like this sort of this really nice sort of even keel calmness that just is like you're just sailing through the water and it's beautiful, right? It's maybe that's why they hate on it, right? It's because it does that. It has that effect. So I wanted to do a little segment here where let's talk about your IT security, people. Let's talk about your IT security. So the job that I just came out of was being an IT security person. So it is my specialty to think about IT security and to think about how that works. What I would like to try and do with you guys is pass some of those things along that I can to help you guys be safer in your computer and online lives, right? So let's talk real quick about passwords. Did you know that most people in America only have 7.1 passwords? 7.1 passwords. Now, that's not to say that they're members of only 7 different things. Most Americans are members on lots of different things, but what we tend to do, and we should not do this, is that we overlap our passwords with other websites, or we utilize passwords in multiple locations. And it's a bad habit that we picked up from how the internet used to work. But as a result of how the internet now works, we need to be smarter. If you're out there and you have password overlap in websites that you're utilizing, say for instance, your email password and your Facebook password, same password. That's terrible. That's very bad, right? Because that's a great score for a hacker to score your Facebook and your email account all in one swoop. And if either one of them is compromised, they're both compromised. And something that you need to understand is that in a weaponized world of computers, when information leaks out, when there's a big hack and somebody steals a whole bunch of account data, generally what happens is that information ends up out on the internet in either the dark web, which is the dark web is a scary kind of sounding colloquialism for the Tor network or onion pages. And that is a part of the internet that you need a specific browser to see. And that information will get traded out there on those forums, or sometimes it'll just get posted out there. Sometimes people will just paste it out there on a page, and they'll just be like, here's the data, go for it, my man. Have fun. So what happens is hackers will take those lists and they will weaponize them. And the way that they weaponize them is they put them into a routine that takes each name and each password and it tries it. Like it'll go to that site and it'll try it. And so if they have, 50,000 accounts for Facebook, they'll weaponize that entire list and they'll try all 50,000. And they'll see which ones are legit and they'll start utilizing, at that point you'll have some sort of account takeover where they might start posting things or start emailing your friends or start sending out marketing things and garbage like that, right? That's pretty common. You got to guard against that. And the way that you do that is to not have password overlap. Another thing that's really important is to not have weak passwords. America is terrible in having weak passwords. A lot of the companies that I've worked for in the past, there was a lot of weak password usage going on. It was ironic because I oftentimes have worked with people who wanted to give me their password or who desired to give me their password. It wasn't that I wanted it. It was because I was the IT guy, right? I had to fix their computer or I had to install things and stuff like that. And so it was very common for people to just give me their passwords sometimes. It was shocking how weak most people make their passwords. Most people make their passwords fairly weak and fairly guessable. So if you've got weak passwords, go in there and strengthen that up. You can always change a password. You can always go in there and make it better. Good ideas are things that you can remember via a mnemonic device. Mnemonic device is a mechanism that is easier for your brain to remember. A good example is you spell something, but you misspell it, and you spell it in a way that only makes sense to you, right? Another thing about passwords is that there are a lot of people out there in the world who are using passwords that are exceptionally weak, and they're based on what is called rotational salting. What that is when you make a password, you have a part that's a simple part, right? And then you throw some salt in there. And the salt, like the most common things, people will use the season of the year and then the year that it is. So they will pick a password that is the season of the year and then the year that it is. Terrible passwords, people. Terrible passwords. You do not want that. That's so much more common than you might think. And part of the reason why is that a lot of personal assistants and things like that, sometimes they need to share passwords with the people that they work with. So as a result of that, you will have these password scheming structures that are pretty weak. Don't do that, people. Don't do that. If you got some bogus password that's a season of the year and a year, get rid of that. Get a better password. You shouldn't mess around with that. Like, you'll get burned on stuff like that. Another thing that's is a big idea of IT security is that IT security is a layered defense. Much like body armor, much like a bulletproof vest, IT security exists on the premise that it's a layered defense. If it was only one layer thick, compromising it would be trivial. There's a lot of different layers when it comes to IT security and how it is engaged, especially at a corporate level. And people who are just individuals, they have different needs, and their IT security footprint is a lot different. Their attack surface is a lot different than a corporate environment. Another thing that I want to mention on the IT security tip is that if you have not turned on your two-factor authentication, which is the mechanism at Google where it's like it sends you a text message with a number, stuff like this, turn that on. Turn that on. It makes every transaction that you do much, much more safe to have two factors of authentication in play. This way, if somebody compromises your password, even if they try to log into your Google account, the two-factor auth will prevent them from guessing the 6-digit number. They could potentially try just taking a stab at a 6-digit number, but the odds that they could successfully hijack your account with two-factor auth on are much, much lower. It's a much safer prospect to have two-factor auth turned on. So if you have not turned that on like your Gmail, whatever you use, if you have two-factor auth available and it relies on a fairly simple mechanism like, sending a text to your cell phone or something, do that. Do that. It will provide a lot of safety for you. And one of the things that's really nice that I like about how modern, like how Google works and stuff like that is that whenever you change something or whenever you log in from a weird device, they'll send you an email that says, hey, we just saw you log in from an unusual device. Are you sure this is you? I'm really thankful that they've done things like that. That is actually the kind of features that are pretty decent security things to just have taken care of it at that level, right? It's really great. What's funny is I hadn't actually even intended to record an entire episode today. I had just sort of intended to record the thing that about too many Matt Mettlers in the world. And here I am. It's 30-something minutes later. I wanted to talk about some of the behind-the-scenes coolness that I experienced when I was in the concert business. Some more of my amazing experiences, right? One of the things that I used to, it was ironically, I didn't know whether to be peeved or flattered when this would happen. But sometimes when I would mix a band, we would set up, and typically what would happen is you set up in the afternoon, and then the band comes in. Usually they've been doing a radio thing, or they've been doing a signing, or they've been doing some sort of promo thing. They come to the hall about 4:30 or something like that, and we do a sound check, right? Typically. And that would last a few minutes. And the sound check is not to get it perfected, but is to just get a rough mix in play where I can start with that rough mix and we can begin from there. And sometimes when I would be mixing bands, that sound check would turn into a practice. It would turn into a session where they were hijacking you and you were going to be their engineer, whether you wanted to or not, for the period of that practice, right? But I had to be sort of flattered because usually this would only happen if they were really feeling it or they really thought that you were doing a good job with sound, right? When you were doing a great job with sound, it made them want to play. They're like, wow, it sounds really great in here. And it makes them want to play. I used to get a little annoyed when sound check would become a session, but at the same time, I was also sort of flattered by that because if they thought it sounded good enough to bother, they were feeling it, right? And there's something cool about that. I wanted to talk a little bit about, I had the pleasure of mixing the sons of Bob Marley during my audio engineering career, Stefan and Ziggy Marley. And I remember when they were separate gigs, right? But I remember each time that I got to mix them, it was so cool because I really had admired their father's music. I really had admired Bob Marley as an artist. He has made some statements in his music that are more true or still hold true. They are just as true today as they were then. For instance, like the great line, "Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds." Bob Marley was the man. So I never got to mix Bob Marley. He passed away before I was really an audio engineer. But on the days when his sons came, it was very special for me, and I was very thankful to have the opportunity to mix for them. And what's cool is they both sound like their dad. Yeah, They both sound like their dad, and it was just so neat to be able to do that. It brought such a smile to my face to be able to mix the Marleys and mix for them. Mixing reggae artists is hilarious because Rastafari artists are very interesting characters, man. And they can be very difficult to understand if they speak with a really heavy Jamaican accent. They can be very difficult to understand. So, yeah, working with Rastafarian bands has always been fun. Lastly, to wrap up this thing about backstage coolness, I want to tell my Queen Latifah story. One season I was working out at Fiddlers Green, and Queen Latifah came with, I think it was some sort of, ladies thing, some sort of ladies show. There's like a couple of different artists, and she was one of them. I've always been a huge fan of Queen Latifah. When I was in high school, Queen Latifah was up-and-coming artist. She was a burgeoning hip-hop artist, and she was one of the few really successful female hip-hop artists in the beginning of hip-hop, right? Like she was right there at the dawn of that whole thing. And I always thought that she was very beautiful. I always thought that she was very pretty. So I was at Fiddlers Green, and we walked past each other in the backstage area as they were arriving. I told her, I said, you were great in Chicago. Chicago is a musical that she was in, and she was fabulous in that. And so later on in the day, when it was kind of in the afternoon and there was the downtime, there wasn't a whole lot going on, I was standing out by the back gate by the buses, and lo and behold, here's Queen Latifah. She walks up, and what was so cool is that she's every bit as beautiful in person as she is in her photos and on TV and stuff. She is just super beautiful, right? And she had a smile on her face, and she touched my arm, my left arm, and she's like, how are you doing today? And it was so crazy, right? Because I was bugging out. Inside my mind, I was bugging out that she had touched my arm. But at the same time, it was like, it was the neatest thing ever because she didn't know it, but she was effectively like fulfilling a dream of mine, man. Just merely standing there and looking at her and talking to her was like a dream. So it was so cool to have that moment. And she was just the nicest person. She seemed like outside the context of the showbiz, she would be a very nice person to hang out with or have dinner with. She seemed like a very wonderful person. And I thought it was so cool that for as famous as she was and for the amount of time that she had been famous, she was not arrogant at all. And I was just like, man, that was so cool. It was so cool of her to be that way. I love meeting artists who are incredibly famous but not arrogant, right? Like there are artists out there in the world who are incredibly arrogant, but their fame doesn't even justify the level of arrogance that they have, right? And then you have people out there in the world who are just incredibly nice and wonderful, and even though they probably, by all accounts, could be arrogant, they choose not to be, right? Another great example of that was Ronnie James Dio. I met Ronnie James Dio in the bathroom backstage at Fiddlers Green. It was so funny. I walked in to use the bathroom, and I go over to wash my hands, and there's Ronnie James Dio at the sink. He's washing his hands and everything. And I remember we had just a little bit of, chit chat. We both dried our hands. It was funny because we turned to exit the bathroom. He went to reach for the door, to open the door. And I was like, no way. I was like, let me hold the door for you, man. Let me hold the door for you, please. He was just so nice. He was so nice. Like, by all accounts, he could have been the biggest, most arrogant prick in the world. But you know what? He wasn't. He was just the nicest guy you'd ever want to meet, right? Totally cool cat that was just super polite and cool. I love when that happens. That's how Charlie Tuna is, too. Yeah, Charlie Tuna, just the nicest guy you'd ever want to meet in person. Really is, man. Very down to earth. Yeah, great dude. So that is the end of my behind the scenes coolness for this episode. I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. I wanted to say thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for listening and joining me here in the podcast. I really appreciate it. Please give it a thumbs up or leave a comment. Share it with your friends. If you have not subscribed yet, please do that. And thank you so much for joining me here for the Matt Mettler Podcast. I really appreciate it. The Matt Mettler Podcast is a Matt Mettler production. Copyright 2019.